Hello and welcome back, everybody, in Psych 1. I hope you're all hanging in there. I hope this continuity that we're trying to create here with the General Psych course can potentially bring some comfort and stability in your lives, but obviously, we're kind of well aware that these might be trying times. So, if you can, please do your best to go through this like you would in any other class. But if you need to take breaks, if you need to step out, totally understand that. Fortunately, with the design of this class, you sort of have that ability to do so. So we can maybe try to, even if it has to be a little disjointed, get through the same stuff that you'd be getting through if you were taking this as the typical in-person class that people take every other semester. And that way you'll be well prepared in some of the future classes or programs that you might take that relate to some of the stuff that we'll be discussing. And in today's class, what we're actually going to be doing is closing out with our discussion of personality psychology. Now, I know when we've been discussing personality psychology, a lot of the focus that we've had thus far has been on different theories of personality, different ways that people have kind of tried to look at individual differences that exist in the population. And for a long period of time, that really was what personality psychology was all about, is picking a philosophy of where individual differences were coming from and then trying to use the tenets or ideas of those individuals to understand or kind of assess a person. There was obviously a lot of intermingling of personality psychology with clinical psychology in those approaches, but over time, that intertwined relationship started to be severed, and essentially clinical psychology started to go its own route, and personality psychology started to go its own route. One of the things that really led personality psychology out of that connection from clinical psych was that social cognitive approach to personality that we talked about in our previous class. People started to finally establish real concrete ways of scientifically studying what was the key elements to personality. And instead of providing this holistic idea that explained everything about us, it started to compartmentalize different components to individual differences and how they had an impact on our daily behaviors. And there was another group of individuals that were trying to do the same thing as the social cognitive theorists that we haven't talked about yet. And that's what this lecture is actually going to be dedicated to. And understand what they were looking at and what they continue to look at. One of the best ways I think we can kind of introduce ourselves to this is to actually just review what personality is all about. So when somebody calls themselves a personality psychologist, what they're really doing is studying consistencies, studying how a person's behaviors are impacted by themselves in ways that carry over time and across situations. Essentially, personality psychologists say that you yourself are a pretty big player in your day-to-day behaviors, not just the situation. And if we know more about you, we can predict what you're going to do across a multitude of different social encounters that you have. And when we're talking about those consistencies, there's kind of an underlying concept or term that most personality psychologists are not always using, but kind of assuming exists. It's this idea of these things called traits, characteristics that we can use to describe those consistencies found in people that carry over across time and situations. And as personality psychology really started to take shape in the 1970s and 80s, as it started to kind of, again, break from clinical psychology, the concept of traits started to become a topic of discussion because people started to realize that if we focused our attention on traits, we could do lots of really interesting things like predict day-to-day behaviors and also tie traits to specific types of outcomes. We could look at things like how long you would live based on different trait combinations you had, or how you do in a specific program if you did come into that program with specific characteristics linked to you. Now, mind you, there is a difference between the concept of traits and types. Other theorists that we've talked about before did look at types of individuals. Carl Jung was one individual who really championed the notion of categorizing people into different groupings. So he'd talk about different personality types that existed. You might have even heard of some of the inventories out there that give you categorization types. We don't like to talk about that too often in an academic setting because those types don't work out very well when looking at individual differences and predicting behavior. Instead, what most personality psychologists like to do is focus on traits, where we can kind of measure you on a scale of, say, 1 to 7 as to how much you possess a specific characteristic. It might seem like a minor difference in terms of categorizing people into whole groups versus just giving them a score, but for research purposes, traits have been perceived by most researchers in this area of personality as the most valuable thing that we could potentially explore if we want to tie traits to other things. But despite that agreement that traits have lots of value and we really should incorporate traits into our research, there's a lot of debate that's occurred over the years as to how we should measure these traits and what traits we should actually use. To understand this debate and where we've settled, that we'd start off with kind of a historical perspective on where trait research started. And to go back to the first trait psychologist, we actually have to go back to about the same time as Sigmund Freud when he was introducing his early theories of personality. In the early 1900s, a very young and up-and-coming researcher named Gordon Allport was working his way through Harvard as an undergraduate, majoring in psychology, and aspiring to do what many people in the early 1900s were aspiring to do: move on after undergraduate education to studying some psychology topic through the lens of Sigmund Freud. In particular, he wanted to work with Freud at the Psychodynamic Institute in Vienna. And like most aspiring people at Harvard and other major research institutes, he found ways to actually make things work and set up a meeting with Sigmund Freud. And in Allport's writings, he talked about this perilous journey that he went through to go across the Atlantic Ocean, travel throughout most of Europe, and eventually arrive at Freud's door to try to convince Freud that he was a wonderful candidate for this Psychodynamic Institute and somebody that could really bring Freud's ideas back to the States. But according to Allport, in his encounters with Freud's, he had this, what he called, breakthrough moment. There was a lot of really interesting tidbits to this that you might learn about in your personality classes when you learn that he kind of met some child on the trip that had some weird quirk to him, and he was telling Freud about it, and Freud essentially assumed that the child was fictitious and the story was actually more about Allport. It's probably a little bit more of a kind of superficial story to highlight why Allport maybe broke from Freud. But whatever the reasoning was, after Allport met with Freud, he came back to the States and really dedicated himself to trying to change or alter the approach that personality psychologists were taking in those early 1900s. And to do this, he decided to return to Harvard, enroll in the PhD program that was just starting at Harvard in psychology. And in 2 years, it's at the age of 24, he was able to actually earn his PhD in his attempts to rewrite what personality psychology was all about. For those of you that aspire to get into graduate programs, please do not put 2 years on your timeline of earning your PhD. This is just completely ludicrous that somebody could try to finish in that short of time. And more importantly, it's even more ludicrous that in those 2 years, you could try to rewrite what a particular branch of psychology is all about. But this is what he did. And when he presented his ideas to a number of prominent researchers in these early 1900s, he was kind of laughed at and told that essentially his ideas were not mainstream enough, that his interest in personality psychology was not aligned with what personality psychologists were studying. It was labeled at the time as a rogue psychologist and kind of kicked out of the major research institutes in the United States at the time. And in fact, he was so kind of dismantled from this that he was asked to leave the East Coast, travel across the United States, and settle in on this newly budding institute that was just starting to really take shape called the University of California at Berkeley. Some of you might have heard of this school before. And it's there that he spent a number of years, actually a couple decades, trying to promote this idea of his, looking at this concept of traits as a way of studying personality psychology. And it wasn't actually until about the 1940s or 50s that anybody really started paying attention to his attempts. So what was it that made Allport so controversial? What was the idea that he had that caused him to have to move to the University of California at Berkeley and spend the rest of his career there? Well, what he talked about was really the tenets of personality psychology, with, of course, his own takes on it. So when he started his presentation, he said, what I want to do in personality research is try to explain why you're doing things. And he said, essentially, your actions in any social situation are really a byproduct of one of two things. Either it's a byproduct of a trait, an enduring characteristic that makes you who you are, or it's a byproduct of a state, kind of a momentary thing that's really cued in by the environment. So if I expose you to a whole bunch of different situations and I see a very consistent reaction within you, I can start to attribute that behavior to a trait. If I see inconsistencies, you changing your behavior across situations, I assume that the state or the social environment is really the key player in your behavior, and I'm not looking at something that would be defined as a trait within you. Once he started to look at traits more closely, he came to argue that there's almost a hierarchy to the different traits that we possess. He talked about how if we have consistencies that only pop up in random situations, we should call these things secondary dispositions. So let's say, you are an extremely aggressive person when you're driving, but that aggressiveness is not a consistent thing that really defines you who you are. If that's the case, then we would call that aggression only in the situation of driving a secondary disposition. If you are instead aggressive across a whole bunch of different situations, not only when driving, but maybe when at school and maybe when playing sports, maybe we would start to define that aggression as something called a central trait, something that really does carry over across time and across a variety of different situations. And his argument was that most of us kind of consist of a combination of central traits and secondary dispositions, consistencies in specific events, and consistencies that do carry over across a bunch of different environments. And in his work, what he set out to do was find ways to quantify the central traits and secondary dispositions that people possessed and see how much of an impact these things had on individuals across a wide range of situations, kind of measure the weight of our traits in each environment that we find ourselves in. It's pretty daunting work. It was actually pretty difficult to do because he treated each individual uniquely, looking at their traits and secondary dispositions to try to understand how much those things were weighing on their behaviors. But it was a novel idea at the time. Now, before we move on from traits, it's probably worth mentioning another concept that he introduced that people still sometimes circulate was this idea of something called cardinal traits. Traits that he said very few people possess, but if they possess them, they really dominate who that person is. Maybe somebody is not just aggressive across a couple situations, but instead that's the thing that defines who they are. Right? You don't think of how smart they are or how considerate they are of individuals or whether or not they like to be around people. You just think of them as being aggressive, and that's it. That would be kind of a rare instance of somebody possessing a cardinal trait. But even in his work, he insisted most of us do not possess these. We're made up of a combination of central traits and secondary dispositions. And again, if we want to understand what you're doing in different situations, we need to know what those traits and dispositions actually are. And again, this idea for a long period of time was pretty much just rejected by many people in the academic community. But as we started to change our tone in the 1950s and 60s, as we kind of went back to looking at concepts in a more research-oriented way, the work that Allport did really served as the impetus behind some of the later developments in trait psychology. There are a lot of individuals that we unfortunately don't get to mention in a class like this. The work of a gentleman named Raymond Cattell is one that's probably really critical in a personality psychology class that you'll learn about. There's also another gentleman that I love talking about named Hans Eysenck, who also contributed to this trait movement. And there was a slew of other individuals that had really prominent roles in the transition from Gordon Allport to where we are today in trait psychology. Just understand when this transition started to take place. One of the first recognitions that people had was that Allport's approach, though interesting, was extremely limited. His intent to treat everybody uniquely seemed admirable, but it also was extremely problematic from a research perspective. If I wanted to say predict who was going to be successful at school, it would be kind of impossible to use traits to predict that if everybody had their own unique set of traits. So a lot of people started saying, instead of using what we nowadays call the idiographic approach to personality research, where we study everybody uniquely and treat them as their own person, something that was consistent in not only the work of Allport's, but the work of Freud's and Jung's and everybody else's, what we should do is move away from that idiographic approach and focus more on what's called the nomothetic approach to personality, where we start looking for universal things that we can measure everybody on, separate them out into, and use those universal things to really look at a wide range of social situations that might be impacted by traits. And this was the task that was actually brought to Allport when personality psychology started to become popular. People started saying, let's just find a consistent way to measure everybody. Not saying that everybody possesses the exact same traits, but maybe find scales that we can measure people on across major components that carry over into a lot of different situations. And in doing so, we can start to use these traits for a multitude of different purposes. When Allport was asked to do this, he worked together with another colleague named Odbert, and they looked through the English dictionary and all the different sources that they had to try to kind of get a sense of how many words we use to kind of describe trait-like things. And Allport published in a major journal that this list of 18,000 different words that he said were really trait related. And he contended in these publications that it would be really tough to whittle down that list of 18,000 words into something that was usable. And for Allport, this really kind of ended his contribution to that discussion. But there were other people, when they looked at that 18,000 words, that quickly realized that we could probably whittle down that list significantly if we did some basic things. One of these individuals was a gentleman that I mentioned earlier named Raymond Cattell, who played a really big role in the development of this nomothetic approach in personality research. And when Cattell looked at this 18,000 different words, he quickly realized that a lot of them overlapped. He saw lots of what we call synonyms and antonyms. For those of you that haven't had an English class in a long time, synonyms are words that mean the same thing, and antonyms are words that mean the opposite of each other. When Cattell looked at this list, he said, look, if I see nice and friendly, I can assume that that's pretty much just indicating the same exact thing. Nobody's going to say, well, I'm very nice, but I'm not friendly at all, or I'm very friendly, but I'm not nice at all, right? They're going to be either high on their level of how nice they are and how friendly they are, low on those levels, or kind of in the middle on those levels. But there's going to be a perfect overlap between those two words. So essentially, one of them becomes redundant. Same thing with the antonyms. If somebody says they're very nice, they're not going to also say, yes, but I'm also really mean at the same time. You're either high on one and low on the other, or you're in the middle on both. But that kind of negative relationship between those makes another one of those terms redundant. And in kind of recognizing these overlaps, Cattell was able to take that list of 18,000 different words that Allport had published and whittle it down to just 35 different traits that he said really did seem to be unique. Now, at the time, in the 1940s and 50s, as we were starting to kind of mull over this option, we were starting to develop mathematical models that really weren't available in Allport's time. One of the things that started to pop up was this really cool mathematical tool called the factor analysis. It's essentially a very specialized correlational measure that looks at how well two things go together, or a multitude of things go together. And when researchers started to look at this list of 35 traits that seemed independent, a lot of people started to ask, could we get that list down even further? So what two prominent researchers named Paul Costa and Robert McCrae did was they asked individuals to rate themselves on a scale of, I think it was 1 to 7, on these 35 different traits that Cattell had sourced out from Allport's original list. And when people started to respond to these 35 traits on how high or low they were, they did this factor analysis to see if any traits started to merge into each other. Even though they might not look like they're the same on the surface, if everybody was responding to them in the same way, maybe they were saying they were high on both, or in the middle on both, or low on both, depending upon the individual, but if there was consistencies, this would indicate that these two things were actually getting at the same thing. So Costa and McCrae ran this factor analysis on 35 different traits for a large swath of individuals. We're able to take that list of 35 and get it down even further to just 5 traits, what we nowadays call the Big Five. And there were other contributors that had major roles in this. In fact, some of the people here at Berkeley had a pretty big role in the development of the Big Five and in the early use of the Big Five. And nowadays, when we look at trait psychology, even though there are different things that people potentially can study, the Big Five is kind of a revolving concept that pops up pretty much everywhere. What you might be asking now is, okay, there's 5 traits. What are they? What are the Big Five that everybody likes to measure people on to see how your traits are impacting your behaviors across situations? Well, the Big Five is often remembered best by a phrase or a word that really highlights what the 5 traits we measure people are on, or what we measure people on. And you might remember this phrase that I spoke of earlier in the class when we were in the memory section. I said, at this point in our personality class, I'm going to tell you that your personality spans the ocean. And it might seem like a corny statement, but it's actually a term or a phrase we use to remember the Big Five. It's also often linked to another word called the canoe. If you want to row the canoe, it's another way to remember the Big Five. It's just a rearrangement of those words in a different order. And this phrase or this word, these words, I guess, do get at the Big Five that these researchers created. The first one is something called openness to experience, where we measure how much people like novelty. Now, there's lots of actual facets within this trait of openness to experience. Actually, each trait has 6 different facets within it that really epitomize different elements to openness to experience. But essentially, openness to experience, if we want to just kind of look at it as a holistic thing, there are general willingness to try new stuff. Or those that are really open to experience, like novelty, like trying to explore things that they've never been to and done, where those low in openness to experience, like consistency. And the key thing here to this trait and all the traits in the Big Five is there's no judgment necessarily being imparted on where you are on this, and it's a scale that you are lying on. So it's not that you are or aren't open to experience, it's that you lie somewhere on this scale, and where you are is not, again, a judgment on you. It's just what we use to predict what you're going to do in different situations that relate to openness to experience. The next one down is conscientiousness, and this deals with organization, dutifulness, and self-discipline. Essentially, if you're right through the roof on conscientiousness, everything in your life is kind of meticulously organized and planned. And if you're very low, you kind of just are more reactive to things. You're not really thinking of things ahead. You're just kind of impulsively reacting to each and every situation that comes to you. Most of us aren't usually in the extremes. We're somewhere along the spectrum or continuum, I guess we'd say. And again, it's not an indictment of you if you're high or low or in the middle on it. It's just a descriptor of who you are and what you should do in situations where conscientiousness traits start to pop up. This, again, works for all 5 traits. So extroversion, introversion is all about our desire to be in the company of others. Agreeableness is how compassionate we are towards others, and also how much we just kind of try to kind of get what we want or get what we think others need versus trying to kind of just, I guess, attend to the immediate situation. And the last one, which is called neuroticism, deals with our reaction to unpleasant or kind of surprising things. With neuroticism, for those of you who are looking at it, having a lot of different facets to it that deal with the types of reactions that we have when unexpected or unpleasant things pop out. There's things like depression scales and anger scales that are all subcomponents of this general concept of neuroticism. Again, when researchers measure you on the Big Five, they don't tell you you're one or the other like with types. They just say, on a scale of 1 to 7, you're this on openness to experience. Or oftentimes they nowadays talk about your percentile in your extroversion levels or your neuroticism levels. They usually also, if you do the exhaustive surveys, break down the facets within the Big Five so you can get a better sense of where you're lying on all of these different traits and the things that are embedded within them. And when we look at the Big Five, what we see is this, again, very science-driven new attempt to personality. And when it started to be introduced, it started to really take form and start to pick up steam to where many people in personality psychology nowadays tend to, no matter what they're looking at, find some way of measuring a trait in individuals, usually through the Big Five, so they can understand how much weight traits had on a behavior in a social situation. In fact, if we're looking at what personality psychology is today, most people who study personality psych now tend to either focus on traits or that social cognitive approach to personality that we talk about now. In fact, pretty much every personality researcher that you'll ever come across here in Berkeley does that exact thing. But as the Big Five rose in popularity, it also encountered some pushback. There were lots of people that were critical of the way it was developed, even if it was developed in kind of an intuitive, rational way. One of the things that people started to recognize as cultural psychology started to pick up in popularity was that we were really culturally biased when developing the Big Five. There was this odd moment of realization that when we came up with the Big Five, we relied on the English language, and we totally neglected the fact that there were more languages in the world than just English. So lots of people said, well, let's try to replicate the process we went through in developing the Big Five, but in a multitude of different languages. And what's really interesting to note is that most languages, especially are what we call Romance languages, that's usually French, English, Spanish, those languages tend to also have the Big Five emerge. But there are some cultures and some languages where we don't just see the Big Five. We maybe see an extra variable or two, or maybe we see certain variables starting to merge with each other within certain cultures or specific languages. One of the examples of variables that emerge in other languages is this thing called religiosity, kind of a term that we sort of use randomly because we don't have an idea of it, at least a real good definition of it in the United States. And this deals with how much a person's life is impacted by their religious affiliation, their religious beliefs. It's not that we don't have religion in the United States or in the English language. It's just that when describing personality, it's not something that seems to emerge in a lot of the factor analyses, at least in the people that were tested in these original Big Five tests and subsequent future ones that were done. It's, again, not that this is kind of a language thing as much as it is just that other cultures, other groups might have more words and might have more focus on this trait when differentiating people and trying to predict what people are doing in different situations. Another thing that's kind of interesting, it pops up in other languages and I don't have it listed here, is humor. We don't actually have humor as a unique characteristic in the Big Five, even though it might impact a lot of our behaviors. Oftentimes it tends to get tied into openness to experience, but in some cultures it's a completely distinct thing. It's also important to note, though, as I mentioned, though, that there are some cultures where the Big Five don't pop up. They maybe have a Big Four or Big Three. And oftentimes, if we're looking for ones that tend to merge in other cultures, it's three of the ones that we've mentioned before. Extroversion and openness to experience in many cultures are very highly correlated with each other, where if you like being with others, you tend to also like novelty and trying out new stuff. In our culture, these things do overlap, but not strong enough to where we need to treat them as the same thing, at least for most people college aged. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And the same thing works for extroversion, openness to experience, and neuroticism, where both extroversion and openness to experience do, again, correlate really well with each other for most people across most cultures. But the neuroticism in some cultures is almost perfectly negatively correlated with those two other traits. Where if you're high in extroversion and openness to experience, you're usually very low on neuroticism. And if you're low on E and O, you're often really high on neuroticism. Essentially enough to where you can get rid of those three things or get rid of treating them uniquely and just talk about them as being kind of one super factor within those cultures. And in the end, what we see is that even though we tend to celebrate the big five as this penultimate thing, it might be kind of a culturally based thing that we can use here to predict behaviors and understand why some people are doing the things that they're doing. But even in that context, there are lots of issues with the big five being used in that way. There's often a cap that people report of a correlation of around zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.3, where even if traits do seem to really matter in a behavior, those traits only seem to be predicting about 10 to 15% of our behaviors. Essentially, what that means is if I want to predict if you're watching these videos on time or if you're talking with your friends still, I can use measures of the big five to sort of get a guess at whether or not you're doing these things, but it's not a great predictor for a lot of that stuff. Instead, there might be specific traits that I can focus on that are a little bit better predictors, or I can just focus my attention on the social situation, which seems to be oftentimes a bigger player. It's not that that means that we should do away with traits, it's just that the weight of traits is sometimes less than ideal when trying to really get a good sense of why we do the things we do. But nonetheless, even though there is all of that pushback to research on the big five and kind of what we use to understand how people become the way they become, a lot of other areas of psychology have started to kind of intertwine their work with research on the big five since it started to really take center stage in personality psych. It's something that social psychologists sometimes study, clinical psychologists sometimes study, cognitive psychologists look at. And all of these different areas that try to tie the big five to their own areas are trying to really understand kind of the way that individual differences might shape some of the things that they're looking at. Another branch of psychology which started to kind of link up some of the things that they were looking at with the big five was developmental psychology, something we've talked about in previous weeks. And as people started to really find ways to quantify the big five, we started to do really interesting research on it. One of the questions that people asked was whether or not the big five, if we're talking about consistencies, is really that consistent within us over time. Not necessarily within the week or across a couple situations, but as we age from childhood to adulthood, do we see consistency is one of the questions that started to be asked. And what we do recognize in most research is that, yes, there tends to be consistency, a lot more as we get older and into our early adulthood years. But even though there's consistency, a lot of us trend in certain directions. So in terms of our responses to questions, we all tend to, at least the way we respond to questions, lower our levels of neuroticism and openness to experience from early adulthood into late adulthood. Essentially, we just get less reactive and less willing to try new things in comparison to the younger us's. Obviously, the percentiles don't really change because, again, you're comparing yourself to others when you're talking about percentiles. But if we compare the older you to the younger you, most of us tend to be less neurotic and less open to experience than we were in the past. As we're going down in these, we tend to become more and more agreeable in life, which sort of makes intuitive sense. We essentially just become less self-centered as we're getting older. And also, we become more conscientious, more organized, more willing to kind of do the important things that need to be done at the time as we get older, at least when we get into middle age and beyond. These numbers are not always 100% consistent for everybody. I'm sure many of you are thinking of a sibling or an aunt or uncle or some random person that you know that had a different shift. But as a whole, as an aggregate, these are things that developmental psychologists have found. And what we've also found is there's lots of what we call cohort effects when measuring the traits of different groups. Cohort effects deal with kind of big overarching changes that happen to cultures that experience specific things at the same time. What we've seen as we've measured the big five in successive generations is that extroversion levels and openness to experience levels over the last couple of generations have really spiked. Essentially, people tend to really feel the need to be around others and try out lots of things in your current generation and some of the other subsequent generations that are following you and ones that are just a little bit before you, especially in comparison to, say, your parents or your grandparents. And what we've also seen is that these changes seem to be following in tow with specific social movements. Your generation tends to be tied a lot to the internet and cell phones. And there's a belief that because lots of you essentially grew up with these things being everywhere, your personality was sort of impacted by these things. If we go back to your grandparents or great grandparents when they grew up during, say, the Great Depression, they had other things that impacted them. Maybe they liked to hold on to lots of stuff that you would never even think of holding on to. Or maybe they were really protective of certain things. And we see each generation having things change us. And it's not that one generation is better than others. It's just that there's differences, right? For those of you that think of extroversion and openness experiences as being this really positive thing, understand that, there's other generations that don't see it in that way. It's just who you are and what's shifted you in your directions due to both you and the kind of encounters that you've had. If we're looking at other really odd things that developmental psychologists have found, one of the things that's worth noting is that attempt to replicate the approach to the big five, finding these factor analyses to do in surveys, has also led developmental psychologists to discover a really odd thing. And that's the fact that the big five really is only something that's tied to people in early adulthood, maybe in late adolescence as well. When we try to measure children on traits and use those 35 different characteristics that we talked about earlier, what we often see is that through the factor analysis, there actually seem to be 7 unique traits that emerge. The big five emerges again, but there's an additional 2 that come in tow, what's called sociability and activity levels. For adults, sociability and extroversion are kind of the same thing. If we like to be around others, tend to talk a lot, and if we like to be alone, we tend to not talk very much. But for kids, those 2 things don't always go hand in hand. There are many children that love being around others, but are completely quiet when they are in the presence of others. And there's lots of kids that don't necessarily like being around people that talk incessantly. It's not that there's always this opposite relationship, like I just gave examples of. It's just those things aren't tethered together like they are for adults. The same thing with activity levels and openness to experience. Most of us who are very open to experience also tend to be high in activity levels when we're adults. But for kids, those things don't have to be intertwined. They can be kind of opposite sometimes for certain people, where there are kids that do love moving constantly, but still like routine and still like doing the same things that they do over and over again. And there are kids that do like trying out new stuff, but aren't completely active, aren't running around constantly exploring every aspect of the world through movement. And this kind of discovery of what we call the Big Seven actually was obtained through somebody that was working here at Berkeley as a graduate student about a decade ago. His name was Chris Soto, and he ran a study actually while he was undergraduate at Harvard and continued that research when he came here to Berkeley, that invited students to go online, young kids to go online with their parents and answer the 35 different questions that we alluded to earlier, kind of measuring people on those traits. And they sold it as a way to figure out which Harry Potter character they were most like. So for those of you that sort of remember just randomly going online and trying to figure out if you were more like Ron or Hermione or some other kid, might have actually been a part of Soto and many of his colleagues' study. And this is where the Big Seven started to be talked about by developmental psychologists studying personality. Another thing that started to be looked at once this got published was whether or not we found these consistencies in the elderly. We recognized that kids had 7 traits, adults seem to have 5. What about people when they get into very late adulthood? Do we still see 5 traits being required to kind of differentiate people? And oddly enough, what we were able to discover is that we really don't need 5 traits. We already talked earlier about how certain cultures tend to have extroversion, openness to experience, and neuroticism have some corollary relationship with each other. When we get older, those things tend to merge into really one just giant super trait. Maybe we call it kind of the super trait of extroversion. And then we also measure people on their openness to, extroversion, openness. We measure people in a super trait of extroversion, another trait in agreeableness, and another trait of conscientiousness. And essentially, those 3 things are what we can use to differentiate the elderly when we want to try to predict what they're doing across a multitude of different situations. And all these things are extremely interesting, and they show some of the directions that people went in once the Big Five started to get established. Another odd thing that started to happen when the Big Five started to establish itself is it kind of got dragged back into the discussion that Gordon Allport himself was trying to separate traits from. If you remember back to Gordon Allport, the person we started talking about earlier, I mentioned that his main goal was to find ways to study not what was causing each individual to be the person they were, but trying to just predict what that person was going to do in different situations, kind of to go away from the past and focus on the now. Well, when people started to measure traits and really look at what individual differences emerged, the next big inkling they had was to say, well, what would cause these traits in the first place? What caused you to become the person that you were? Essentially trying to revisit this trait perspective through some of the old Jungian and Freudian perspectives of looking at the emergence of personality. And what we've seen through developmental psych research and other types of analyses is that there are seemingly a lot of things that do dictate which traits we have. One of the most powerful things that impacts a lot of the traits that we possess is, we think at least, our genes, our genetics, our biological predispositions for certain traits is sort of undeniable if we look at a multitude of different studies that have compared different sibling pairs and parents and their children, especially when we get older. There is an overlap oftentimes between young children and their parents in terms of traits, but if we follow up with these children 10, 20 years later, what we tend to see is that their personality gets closer and closer to their parents as they get older. Essentially, the inconsistencies, the situational factors tend to be overridden by personality characteristics that are maybe inherent within us. And this has been something that we've consistently found across cultures and over a multitude of different studies. Essentially, whatever your parents are like, there's a decent chance that a lot of what you're like is kind of tied to them, whether you like it or not, I guess. That doesn't mean, though, that it's the only thing that impacts traits. Another thing that people started talking about when looking at the emergence of traits was the roles, the groups that people started to associate themselves with, being a really critical catalyst in the movement of people in specific directions. What the learning approach suggests is if you identify with a specific gender or a specific racial group or a cultural group, it can vary from person to person as to what exactly we're identifying with. But once you identify with that group, you tend to really align your behaviors that we relate to personality to that group. So if we find a combination of your biology and the groups that you say you're a part of, we essentially can have a really good sense of what you're going to do across a lot of different situations. Now, this learning approach, though, took time to really pan out in research. There were a lot of theorists that argued that this was probably huge in the development of traits, but they couldn't seem to find ways to identify how impactful it was. In fact, most research suggested it seemed to be minimally impactful when they started looking at it in the first place. And that's when people started to realize that there was an inherent flaw, a problem with the research that was being conducted, looking at how prominent the learning approach was. And that's the fact that when people were asked to rate, say, how high or low they were on their friendliness levels or their studiousness levels, they tended to not compare themselves to everybody in the population, but they tried to compare themselves instead to the groups that they were a part of. So it's tough to say how much a group we're a part of is impacting us if we're rating how intelligent we are based on the people that we associate with. We tend to call this in cognitive psychology an anchoring effect, where once we start to kind of compare ourselves to others, we don't go very far from that group, but we kind of use that as our medium of trying to understand what we're like. A great example of this would be if I say asked a collection of individuals that was not very studious, maybe high school dropouts, how studious they were on a scale of 1 to 7. They wouldn't say, oh, I'm a high school dropout, I don't really like school, therefore I'm definitely a 1. They'd probably say, well, out of my group of friends, I like to watch a couple shows that are informational and do a couple things, so I'll give myself a 3 or a 4 on studiousness levels. And you can contrast that with somebody that maybe goes to a major research institute or has been a scholar for their entire life. They don't say, I'd like to compare myself to the whole population. They say, well, what am I like in comparison to my scholar peers? How studious am I in that respect? And that really shifts the numbers a lot. And if we control for those things, especially if we ask about behaviors related to traits, not people rating themselves, what we see is that this learning approach really starts to take shape and it starts to really counter the genetic influence that we talked about earlier. And in essence, when we combine the learning approach with genes, we see we can predict a lot about your traits without even knowing anything about your day-to-day behaviors. And this, again, really highlights one of the major movements that people have started to look for when studying personality psychology. In fact, it's going to be the last thing that we're going to be discussing with personality psychology as a whole, and the other half of personality research. Again, we did talk a lot about traits, but it is worth mentioning that social cognitive approach to personality we mentioned earlier still exists, and there are still some people that study personality through the humanistic approach, through even the Jungian and the Freudian approach, especially if you get into other professions. But here in personality psych, understanding those two areas is really important, especially if you move on to future classes that are going to look at personality psych. What we're going to do here for our intro class is kind of pivot away from personality psychology, but not too far, because what we're going to be doing now is going into an area of psychology that is sort of, as I mentioned earlier, and have been tethered to personality psych since its introduction, a branch of psychology that we called clinical psychology. There's a lot of really touchy things that we're going to be talking about when we get into clinical psychology, and a lot of things that I want you to be kind of well prepared for, because it is a very sensitive topic. So if you can, I encourage you, before you even watch the videos for our next class, read the clinical psych chapter, read the assigned readings, so you're kind of more attuned to what we're going to be discussing. And that way you can really listen to my words and really try to get a sense of not only the information within it, but the context I want you to take it in. That's going to do it for today. Good luck with everything. Hopefully you take a little bit of a break off if you are trying to clump this into that 2-hour period that we've been doing, so you can really get the most out of this clinical psych lecture. Sorry for stumbling on my words there. I guess I'll see you all very soon. Take care.